welcome back to another Stories of Facilitating Software Architecture and Design. With me is Andrea. And today, again, we have Elena and Pete. And this time, Pete will tell a story. And it was a great last episode. If you haven't seen it, go listen, watch, or read it back, because it was nice to hear stories from both sides as a technical lead and an architect from the same company trying to go through this process. And today we're going to talk and listen to the story of Pete. Welcome.
Right. So I guess one of the things we did a talk about this and the advice process at QCon, and one of the questions we got, and probably the biggest reactions, was about a decision that a team took that I wasn't happy with or I didn't agree with. That's always the first question, right? So what about one of the decisions you didn't like? And I mean, there've been a couple, but generally it's not been too bad. There was one, which I won't name specifically, but it was a decision that I knew it was quite early on in the advice process. I knew they were keen to try new technology, and they were kind of, I use the kids in the sweet shop. They wanted to try something new. They wanted to push the boundaries. You could see that it wasn't quite right and it wasn't well thought out. Again, that's my opinion. We talked about opinions last time. But it's really difficult to try and sit there and have a conversation when your emotions are telling you that it's the wrong decision. And I think one of the reflections that I've had on this is that a lot of it's actually about you. And when you're in that conversation and giving advice and feedback, what you should be looking at is your own feedback. Because I think my feedback was clearly not good enough. You know, if I had had a more persuasive argument or given some bit of information that would have helped change their mind. So I would always, before, I guess, from an architectural perspective, I'd always reflect first on myself and whether I gave the right feedback, gave the right comments to kind of give them the bigger picture that they needed to make that decision. But it is really hard, especially when you're invested in them. And there are other decisions that have been and gone. And one of the ones that Elena made early on was to part of the system that I'd worked quite a lot in. So I think there's that emotional attachment as well to decisions. So Elena was effectively throwing everything I'd done in the bin, but it was moving forward. And I knew that it needed to move forward and it was the right decision. There was some nuances to that decision. Again, you have to take your emotion out of it. And I think as an architect, it's trying to get that balance, especially early on, between not being too standoffish, so not giving any feedback because you don't want to be seen to be leading the witness, but also not being just another opinion in the room. And I think that balance is quite a tricky tricky thing to learn. And I think that doing it with the support of others makes it a lot easier. And I think also having conversations with the tech leads before they were taking decisions to the forum really helped there. But yeah, it was, I think there are always going to be decisions that you don't agree with because there's so many different ways to build software, right? So there's always another way. But I would definitely, if I was giving a little bit of advice, I would say always reflect as an architect on your feedback first before thinking they're making the wrong decision.
Yeah, so that raises a question because I'm dealing with this a lot myself. Thanks for that. And also towards Elena, in your story last time, Elena, something that I noticed was you were talking about what I rather call the hard skills. People call it soft skills, but they're the harder skills, right? Asking good questions. And what I noticed is because you were doing the advice process and you were asking for question, you mentioned something about now that I'd asked questions about the cost, I really understood what it did and that changes my decision. So I think that was really powerful, but it requires you to have these skills. So my follow-up question would be, what happens when teams don't necessarily have these skills yet of questioning? Then it might be what you're saying, Pete, a candy shop for them, right? Because you want people to also take the accountability and not only be in the sweatshop and thinking they have $1 million to spend. Did you deal with that? Because I think there's a bit of a tension, right? I mean, you can trust people, if they also take the accountability and understand what Elena was saying, oh, it will cost this once. Well, maybe it's not such a good idea then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the challenges, because at the beginning we were like just trying the new thing. We were not prepared, like you should have these skills, you should have these technical and soft or hard skills to try it. So we were just adapting through the process. And at the beginning, yes, it was kind of, I can try this, like, should I do this, or etc. But I think for me, there were the two main things that helped me through that process. First thing was that we have architecture principles, and we have that following us through the process of making the decision. So whenever you're doing any of the architecture decision, you should go through that architecture principles. And there we have like architecture principle for the cost. And you, when you're making, you should consider, oh, should I spend this money for this, or there is a better option? And that guide me through the process from the technical part of it. When we were making the decision, we were always trying to do that, following that architecture principles. And also, yeah, for the soft skills, I think some people will have it, someone will not have it, but you can build them. But most important is to have someone who will support, advise you to do that, to use them. You might have them, but you're not using them. You will not have it, but you start to build them. And I think that here was where the Pete and Andrew role was coming for us. And you must have people who will help the other people who are making the decision to be accountable, to build the trust that they will make the right decision. They might not do it at that time, but they will do the best in that time. And to have transparency, it's really important to have that kind of culture. So it's important to build that culture within your team and everything. And I think that is where Pete and Andrew role came. And they really help us in that process.
Let's do a somewhat adjacent question on the thing. I think that, by the way, that whole thing about how to soft skills and also how architectural principles are very useful makes so much sense. Thanks for that. But my follow-up question is a bit adjacent, I think, to your story, Peter, which is what happens when the decision is on the boundaries of a couple of teams? Let's say you don't like it, or maybe you're like, oh yeah, or maybe not. But the problem is today with this is affecting the boundaries, because this leans a lot on teams owning decisions. But what about when decisions are impacting more than one team, or when the decision is about changing the boundaries of the team, and then you start getting your spidey senses going like, oh my God, it's not.
Might be full on.
It's not just that.
Andrea, it might be a full on Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, context was what we used to call those things. So it was when you start to get into the gray areas of the boundaries, and then what you don't want is guards, walls to go up and everyone to get defensive. So it's about facilitating communication. It's still about getting people to talk. And sometimes you are going to have to redraw those boundaries. And actually, we've had a couple of instances where I think the teams have come to that conclusion themselves. I think once people do get the context map and understand that it's there for their benefit, for fast flow, for them to work autonomously, make decisions independently, they see the benefit of those of getting the context map right. But it was hard to start with, I think. And, you know, there'll still be some niggles. I guess, Elena, what do you think?
Yeah, there are still that kind of conversation. Even that context map, should this decision lives in this team, or it should live with some different team, or there are situations when we have like one decision that can be influencing the other teams. And yeah, it is challenge. It is. But it's important to have that kind of conversation and agreement. What will be the best thing? So for me, it's important to try to think how that will look in the future. Also, you know, it's not a decision that the decision you're making is not just impacted you now, but also in the future. How that will impact the system and also the program, the teams in the future, and making kind of agreement there. We have a lot of discussions within the teams, and sometimes there is a kind of similar thing. I have mentioned like sharing the knowledge and everything. Sometimes there will be like similar challenges, like similar functionality, but different team will make the decision that they can do it with different ways. Sometimes we were like discussing, should we just follow one approach or like a shared decision that will influence everyone, and we will say, okay, we will do this for everything. But I think we ending up like people within the teams to make the decision. So if the team think that they will not, that's the decision made previously, it's not something that will work for their cases. We have a situation when they build it differently, but we have a situation when we are just following it. It's depends of. Again, it's more important to have the conversation and the discussion and conversation to be first transparency, to share the decision is made, everyone to be aware of consequences of everything or the reason for the decision, and after that to have a healthy discussion. And I think the agreement will come. Not everyone will be happy, but
So one of you, I can't remember who said it first, someone mentioned the context map. Can you tell us about the story of the context map?
So do you want to go?
now I feel
So the context map was when Andrew joined us on our journey, we set about moving to DDD. And so we started to create a context map. And what we wanted was to align with key principles from Accelerate. We wanted autonomous teams. We wanted loosely coupled architecture, but we were dealing with a legacy application. So it definitely didn't fit in the world of DDD. So what we had to do was take the map, the architecture, and then chop it up. And it wasn't pretty. And those boundaries weren't good boundaries. So this is where some of the context wars come from. I think if you were in a situation where it was greenfield and you had a bunch of teams creating something new, it'd be far easier. But we were making things difficult for ourselves. So we had new ways of working. We had the new advice process. We had the context map. To Ellen's point in the previous conversation, it was all new. Context map was our guide to try and make sure that the teams could work independently and also help with the decision-making process. Hopefully, most of those decisions wouldn't cross teams, although with a legacy application that's moving to cloud, there was always going to be some crossover.
Did you map like a spatial map of where decisions have impact? That's now a thought that comes in my mind. Would that be helpful?
So we haven't. I mean, it would be interesting, helpful. I'm not sure, but it would be interesting. I think it would be interesting because it would probably tell you something about the architecture because of the decisions that had to be made in those areas. So it might tell you, it might be an indicator to a well-architected part of the original solution that didn't need so many decisions. It might be useful now I'm thinking it through in my head, maybe it would be helpful because you could see where the churn is in parts of the architecture. So we can do that through Git repos, but actually if you paired that with the decision records as well, that's a richer picture. So actually, yeah, I've changed my mind. It is helpful.
Yeah, we're going to do another episode, not sure when, but about metrics, right? So it might be a nice sense making as the same team.
Yeah.
If there's a lot of new ADRs popping up from teams that are like touching the boundary, that was the first thing that came to my mind. Oh, I've never done this. So you have the context map. And if you can see, well, these ADRs are continuously touching different teams, that might be a sense making. Or if you get a fitness function, that would be a nice.
Yeah. So thinking about it now as well, when you see some of these kind of platforms that look at the DORA metrics and space metrics and where they're pulling information from, maybe that's one of the next things to pull in the ADRs and then overlay those.
I forget the name of the tool that's using Git and everything and looks at communication. Like you wrote a book.
Is it CodeSync?
Yeah, CodeScene. Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, it is CodeScene. I'm not sure if it's already in there because I haven't worked with that, but that would be a great thing.
Actually, that brings me to the question of the granularity of the decisions, because, let's say team A, lots of decisions and they're really got into it. They're like small and good. And then other people are like, we don't know about decisions and not feeling the warmth of decision making. Maybe team A would do many small decisions and team B would be like, one decision a month. That's way too much. And again, I'm just imagining, but I can imagine how finding the granularity might have been a challenge. Did you find a good way to deal with that?
I think it's broad. I think each team's different. Each team, like you've got different characters. I think if you've ever done like the disc profile, you can definitely see the different types of character drives a different type of adoption of ADRs and how frequently they come. I think what we tried to do to encourage the writing of ADRs was that you can have ADRs that you write that don't go to the advice forum. So again, there could be smaller decisions that are made that don't see the advice forum, but they're still tracking decisions that were made internally within the team. So because they didn't meet the criteria for the forum. But I think it is very different across the teams. What you try to do is, what I tried to do was to try and get consistency. But I think it's just, if I reflect on that, I don't know whether it's worth it. I think as long as people are finding their right flow and we're not seeing decisions creep through that have an impact after the event that weren't documented, then I think you're hitting the right balance.
Well, thank you. This was another great story, especially me as an architect, I can very much relate to this one as well. Same as yours previously, Elena. So thanks for sharing your story about what do you do when you don't agree, right? So that's a good one. So thanks. Now, for anyone listening or reading or watching this, which hopefully is also reading or listening, then you can join Discord where you can continue this conversation. We'll be back with another story in probably 2 weeks. Maybe we go even faster. We'll see. But join us, like us, and see you next time. And thank you very much. Bye-bye.